we can train ourselves to do almost anything by like starting small, setting the intention, repeating it every day, checking in and reevaluating like what's working, what's not working, disassociating everything from your phone, whether it's like listening in a conversation or driving somewhere or learning something new. Put your phone down. I mean, you might be learning on there, but if you can just kind of like untether yourself, put your phone in a drawer, in another room, learn how to go for a walk without it and realize that the world doesn't end. And then do that one activity with your full attention. Try to repeat that process every day.
This week, I'm sharing the second part of my conversation with Thatcher Wine, who is the CEO and founder of Juniper Books and is also a serial author, written a few incredible books such as the 12 Monotasks and also For the Love of Books, which has a great cover. I would highly recommend picking it up. So I would definitely recommend going back and listening to the first part of our conversation, but you can also feel free to jump right in here. In this part, you're going to hear us talking about the role of books in our lives and the sense in which books have begun to transcend simply their functional use and actually begin to take on other properties in our lives as vessels for memories, as ornaments, as things that hold some aspirational value, as representations of the values and ideas that we want to share and communicate with others. We also talk about the curation of home libraries. What does it take? What goes into it? And how Thatcher himself learned to curate home libraries for celebrities such as Gwyneth Paltrow and Shonda Rhimes. We talked about the founding journey behind Juniper Books, what led him there, all the various steps along his path. And then we talked about the intersection between reading and productivity. We talk about how to find more time to read, how to create meaning in our tasks, and this concept of monotasking and how it can help us to create more room for the things that matter and help us apply ourselves more meaningfully to the work that we do. So overall, this was a really fun and fantastic episode. I would highly recommend listening to both parts of this conversation. It was a ton of fun getting to speak with Thatcher. You can get the full show notes, the transcript, and read my newsletter at theknowledge.io. You can find Thatcher online on Instagram at Thatcher Wine, and his website is thatcherwine.com. We'll have links to all his stuff and all his books in the show notes and in the description. And if you love this episode, please do share it with a friend, and don't forget to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because it helps us tremendously to find other listeners just like you. Yeah, there's another connection that just came to mind as you were saying that, which had never occurred to me before, but it is similarly interesting, and you can tell me whether or not this resonates with you in any way. What you were saying now just reminded me that in Japan, very often you hear people talk today about how they love the idea of samurai, and there's, samurai have this place in popular culture that, wow, they were so cool, they did this, they did that. There's recent shows like Shogun that are incredible, and they show all these great samurai. But I think what's interesting is if you look historically, most of samurai becoming cool was after the time that samurai were actually useful or needed, right? So you actually had the Warring States period where you had these samurai were basically just mercenaries, right? They were just hired hands that became kind of like nobility in a sense, but really a big part of their role was, rounding up rabble rousers. And, if you were a particular lord, you would send out your samurai to go and, kill some people or go and take care of certain things. And so you had that period of time. But then what happened is you then enter a period of unparalleled peace, the Tokugawa era, that you haven't had this kind of peace before, where you're not having war all the time. And so the swords, the swords and the tea and all these things that previously had a functional purpose became almost ceremonial. And now suddenly you have all these tea ceremonies, and you have the sword that has this reverent place in the home. You have this little stand for the sword. And so there's a lot of the things, the iconography that we look at when we think of this period of time mostly comes from the time after the time. It's really the time where it then became a lot more ceremonial, a lot more purposeful. It was this thing that there was ceremonies around the swords, and you pass down the sword down your family, your lineage, because at this point in time, samurai were no longer out there fighting for the majority of the time. They were mostly just nobles. They were just, now became part of the upper class, and they were mostly indoors. And so you kind of needed all these things to keep the law alive, right? And so the lore of the past stories of these great people now just became embedded in these artifacts. And so all of that to say, I think there's a similar sense in which I wonder that books have taken on a similar role. You see on Instagram and on places where people will post their coffee table books. And I don't even know if some people have ever even opened any of those books, but they are just things that you buy so that people see them when they come over for dinner or something and they say, "Oh, you have this, how cultured," or you have books in your Zoom background or something like that. And so it's strange how, in a similar way, books can take on a sort of ornamental nature when most of the time, day to day, you're not actually reading, but the books, instead of having some functional place, become ornamental in a sense, and they're more useful for what they signify than for what you actually use them for. But I think, and I'd love to hear more about, like your friends say, oh, how were you so prescient to know to start Juniper Books? But I'd love to hear more about, first of all, maybe even the business that you started before that didn't do well. I'd love to hear about some of the circumstances around that. But then also going into founding this company, why and what made you think that it was useful or purposeful to think about books in a particular way, to want to design beautiful covers for books and have beautiful collections of books. I think you even have a patent for designing custom book covers in a particular way. And so I'd love to hear more about that thought process. And then I think that will then, there's a link that I later want to draw to some of what you talk about in your most recent book as well.
It's a really fascinating conversation. We're covering a lot of good ground. So going back to, some of the things I've done over my career. So the most current iteration of Juniper Books is this 80% of the company roughly is like about making these special edition book sets of essentially the series that people know and love, the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potters of the world, and kind of giving people a special edition that's beautiful, collectible, looks great on the shelf. And I will say, it also feels beautiful in your hands. And I will say, like, I'm a big believer that, like, you don't have to read all the books you have in your home. Like, you shouldn't feel bad about that. Some of it can definitely be aspirational, right? So the coffee table books or the books on your shelf. Like, if you want to project the image that you've read them, and you might read them, you hope to read them. And if the main hurdle is like lack of time and inability to like sit down and read them, and you just hope to read them in your retirement or something, I think that's fine. I don't think we should feel bad about that. And to be honest, like the more I have some self interest in this, obviously, but the more books that there are in the world, the better the world is. Like there's a better chance that people will understand, and have empathy and know about history. And also they're supporting authors and supporting publishers and booksellers. And those are all good things for the world. So definitely, have more books. I think that's a good thing for all of us. And how I got into the business, it was not a business decision. It was a hobby. So I had been, in the tech business. I'd worked for like an early web developer in the 90s and built websites for some big companies and was like the business development guy, kind of in the early internet 1.0. And, a lot of what I realized is like these companies were building their marketing sites and their sales sites to sell cars and advertise their restaurants or things like that, but they weren't really thinking about customer service. What was going to happen when they had a website and then everybody wanted to reach them and be like, "Hey, is my warranty still valid?" Or, "I had a problem with my blender." And so I left and I started a company, raised some venture capital, essentially have a customer service portal. It's called Feedback Direct at the beginning, to basically send feedback to companies and kind of route all the communications to the appropriate people. It's a little bit ahead of its time. It also turned out that like those companies didn't want an intermediary knowing their dirty laundry, what was wrong with their products and what their customers are upset about. So my whole business model was predicated on like being that intermediary. And so in 2001, when a lot of internet companies were having trouble with funding, we decided to, close up shop, and I moved to Colorado. And one of the things I started doing was buying and selling rare books and first editions. I was able to take a little bit of time off and was, kind of had my renaissance year. Was like making pottery and relearning French and writing screenplays. And one of the things that a friend of mine from college got me into was selling books. And back then it was all about putting them on eBay and basically going to antique auctions and thrift stores and estate sales and, developing my knowledge base about like what was the first edition, what was, fine condition, what maybe was signed by the author, had some interesting provenance, history of the book of who had owned it, and then telling that story in the descriptions I wrote and put on eBay initially, and then eventually some other rare book sites like ABE Books and Alibris and a little bit on Amazon. And it was super fun. I loved it. I mean, it was just like research and storytelling. And I had a good knack for like finding kind of hidden gems. And I would go buy, in that era, there were also like a lot of used bookstores that were going out of business. And I was like the young guy in a world of kind of grumpy old men in the book business. And I was the young guy who would like had the energy and the willingness to like go buy 25,000 books when the store went out of business and pick through them and digitize the inventory and put it online. So I had kind of a blast doing it. And then a few years into it, a friend of the family had built a house, and their architect had told them, you should really have bookshelves in every room. And they were like, sure, we'll put bookshelves in every room. And then they were getting ready to move in. They were like, we don't own any books, and this is our beach house, our second house. Can we hire somebody to fill the shelves quickly and make it look like we had picked out the books? And so I like interviewed them and developed this whole process of like, how do I curate a library for somebody else, and kind of put myself in their shoes and their kids and the mom, the dad, the guests and all that. Like, what would I want on these shelves? And they're putting together 3,000 books for them. So not a problem that like everybody has on a daily basis, right? Most people I know like don't have enough bookshelves and they have too many books. This was the opposite of that. And I loved the process of like just channeling who they were and their personality and the design of their home. Like, should the books be brightly colored, or, oversized coffee table books, or, a mix in different rooms? They loved it. What I put together, their interior designer loved it. They started referring more clients to me. And I kind of made that my niche of, curating custom libraries. A couple years into that, people started asking for things that didn't really exist, right? They'd be like, can you, get me the 500 most important novels ever written, but make them look pink? And I was like, well, my options are to rebind the books, but that'll take like another 10 years and cost, a fortune. And that's when I invented the book jackets. So I just started playing around with like a laser printer and, folding jackets, different paper types, eventually graduated to like large format art printers and specialty papers and laminates and all that. Do a lot of R&D. And so, yeah, we could make things. So if somebody's like, I want, these trashy romance novels, but I want them to look like an antique leather, collection of Charles Dickens. We can do that. And then I started like making these images that go across the shelf. So, for a hotel in Tennessee here, we did like a satellite image of Knoxville, Tennessee across the shelves. And it's like 16 feet wide by 10 feet tall. So really cool, fun, ways. Those aren't really for reading. That's really just like an art installation. But it's a creative reuse of books that would otherwise go into the landfill. And then on the other opposite end of the spectrum are more like the original first client, custom client I had, where, people are reading every book and they're like looking at all the titles and they're like, how do you know that I would have picked this out, if I had gone shopping and bought these books? And it's just like, I kind of use whatever empathy and understanding of, if you like this, then you'd like that, but in the human way, not the Amazon way. It's just all in my brain to build these collections. And then I still do that, all that custom stuff. And then every year we launch like 25 or 30 new products that are the book sets that are largely like very contemporary, living, active authors writing these popular series that I referred to before that like people just go crazy over. And now they want like a limited edition or special edition. So we kind of make all those available to consumers worldwide.
So you wrote this book for the love of books. And first of all, I must say, you and Thatcher Wine and Elizabeth Lane are two of the most classical names to write a book like that. And the cover of the book looks beautiful. Everything about that book I love. But I'm interested in pretty much what you were just saying. And maybe I'll kind of take it in two directions. One, I think in that business, you designed book collections for people like Gwyneth Paltrow and Shonda Rhimes and a ton of incredible people. What does that process look like in terms of like what goes into building a collection for people like that? But then also connecting this to something we mentioned earlier, this idea of space, this idea of the preciousness. A lot of people don't have space, especially in today's world. Most people are complaining that they can't buy a house, or the place that they end up having to live in is too small, they don't have enough room. And that's even why a lot of people, including myself, might end up buying a lot more ebooks and audiobooks, because you don't have a tremendous amount of space to have all the physical books that you would like. There's a great irony in me saying that I've got some books behind me here, but I've also got books downstairs in the hallway, and I've got some books in my room. I've got some books in my parents' house. I think I've got some books in my sister's bedroom, littered around every place that I've ever been because I haven't brought them all into one place. I'm having to store my books in loads of different places. So the other part of the question is for the everyday person who wants to curate a collection of books, who wants to have some books, whether they're to read or to look at and aspire to read one day. How do you think people should be looking at books in order to build a small library of their own?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of space constraints is a real issue, and I think it's an opportunity rather than a hindrance to having the collection that you want, ideally. And there's a whole section in For the Love of Books about how to get rid of books and how to decide whether to keep something. There's tips on at least in the U.S. like how to responsibly give them away to local organizations and libraries and all that, or sell them. But I think it's if you think about we live in the physical world. There's not unlimited shelf space or physical space to keep everything. And we also we change over time. Like something that was important to us when we were younger, we may decide it's just not part of who we are today. And so it's time to give away that book, let somebody else, have it. So I think in my own house, just in terms of themes in different rooms or on different bookcases within the rooms. I'm in my home office. So there's this research collection behind me about the book I'm writing on next. But in the bookshelf to my left, my collections of Kurt Vonnegut and Nick Hornby and Mark Twain and things like that that I love. And, so I think if you think thematically, whether it's just one little shelf, these are my favorite books, or this is the room where I want to do all my reading about wellness and spirituality, or I'm going to leave all my, cookbooks and books about art and design at my parents' house, things like that. You can start to kind of break apart the larger problem of my library into I have this collection and that collection and that collection. And then within those collections, you can be like, oh, this is my favorite book. I'd really love a leather bound copy of it. So upgrading a book within that. Or, oh, I've got the 5 books in this series, by Tolkien, but, 2 of them are in paperback. So I'm going to upgrade those to hardcovers or get the Folio Society edition or the Juniper Books edition. So you can kind of make these micro decisions about things that are important to you, giving away the things that you're just ready to let go of, and kind of honing in on what are your interests? What's your, what story do you tell about yourself? What story do you want to tell to the world? What do you want people to notice when they come over? Maybe put those books, front and center. I don't think that's superficial or egotistical or narcissistic or anything. It's just this is who I am. You're inviting people to ask you a question. Oh, I didn't know you were into French alternative cinema or whatever it may be. You have a book on it. And that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But hopefully you really are interested in it. You've at least seen the movie. So, I think there are a lot of ways. I kind of describe it like DNA. It's everybody's book collection is different. There's no 2 book collections that are the same. Even if they have the same 100 books, they're arranged differently, different order. One person might be by color, alphabetical, by size, horizontal, vertical. There's all sorts of variations, and I cover that in my book too. And I think that's a great thing to know you're unique, but that there's some common interests with other people, and then you can kind of express your individuality through your book collection in your library.
Hey, we'll get back to the episode in just one moment, but I wanted to tell you very quickly about my newsletter. I started sharing everything I was learning online, and a few thousand people came along for the ride. I send 3 regular emails. Brainwave fortnightly on a Tuesday, which is about the intersection between technology, philosophy, and psychology. Then every week on a Thursday, I send Revelations, and that's about creativity and productivity. And then finally, every other weekend, I send Wayfinder, and that's about decision making. So people in the audience actually send me really tough problems that they're working through, and I help to deconstruct them using mental models and decision-making frameworks. So if you'd like to subscribe, you can join me and over 20,000 incredibly driven people at theknowledge.io. Okay, back to the episode. Funnily enough, just as you were saying that, I was thinking of some of my coffee table books. I have some friends coming over later this evening, and I think, you can also have a blend, a balance, right? Where the books I have on my coffee table are books that I do think in some way maybe represent my curiosities and my personality, but they're also books I'm actually interested in. I don't think I wasn't looking in some catalog of where to find these things, but each one, maybe I found it in one place or I found it in another place. Actually, no, one of them did come from a recommendation. It's called Dressing the Man. And I like, I have some interest in fashion and clothing and things like that. And so that's an interesting book which covers some history, it covers materials, it covers loads of things. And it's a beautiful book. And then I have another which is Sotheby's World of Wine. I found that on the street. That's one of my best findings. It's a beautiful book. Again, it covers the history and where you can find wine in loads of regions around the world. I happen to like wine, so there's that. And then there is, I forget the precise name, but it's a book of all the towns and counties in around the United Kingdom. And again, just a very random book, but I personally find that incredibly interesting. I want to go read about this random village in Wales. And, that's a book I have that I can read about that. And so on one hand, it might be actually of some functional interest to me, but also it's something that I can have there and people can come across it and have some sense of who's this person and whose house I'm in and what are they like and what are they interested in and things like that. I wanted to make a bit of a connection here. It's a slight detour, but before you mentioned this idea of books having a bit of a renaissance period in our lives now. And when you were saying that, what that made me think of was TikTok, right? And you mentioned romantasy and some of these things. This is where some books are becoming popular now. And you have, Book Talk on TikTok, and then you have BookTube on YouTube, and you have all these people recommending books. They're sharing their to be read lists. But one thing that I found really interesting that seems to be more of a current trend is people feeling burnt out because their reading list is too long. They don't have enough time. And these are people that supposedly love books. These are people that are hoarding books. These are people that are on Goodreads, cataloging every single thing that they come across, but they get burnt out. They feel like they don't have enough time. And this maybe then connects back around to what you were mentioning in terms of like monotasking and this idea that I think in general, people, especially coming out of this pandemic period, people feel like they don't have enough time. They're struggling with the responsibilities that they have, the aspirations that they have of wanting to have and own and read particular books. But how do you find the time to do these things? I'd love to hear you maybe explain or expand a bit more on this concept of monotasking and the role that it has in our lives and why it's useful, why people should care, and how that helps people.
So I think that, the burnout and the sense of overwhelm is real, whether you're talking about like, I just have too many things to do around my house or I have too many books to read. Like it's essentially the same thing. Like we just tend to like something and then kind of, hockey stick it and be like, I'm going to, do more and more and more and more and more. And then it's like, I don't have enough time and I'm not going to do any of it. Or you develop a negative association with something that's otherwise good for you. So I think we have to recognize that first of all, and just not put too much pressure on ourselves. There's only so many hours in the day. You don't have to read every single book. You definitely don't have to read books you don't like, right? So a lot of people are like, your friends on Goodreads or whatever talking about it, and you're like, I don't like it, but I'm going to persist. And I'd say just move on. There are too many books to read in our lifetimes. But I think part of the key to reading anything is like developing at least a weekly habit, ideally a daily habit of reading something on paper 15 minutes a day. Studies have shown like 20 minutes is kind of like a magic number for like most people just can't do one thing for more than 20 minutes. So you have to like train yourself to be able to, read for more than like 2 minutes, then 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 15 minutes. I find it really helpful to have like a specific place in my house to read. So I have a reading chair where I am most productive and, can read for the longest a certain time of day. So just experiment, figure out, what works for best for you. Is it like in the morning before everybody else gets up and you really started checking your emails and kind of started the hamster wheel of your day? Or is it to wind down at night? Or is it, your lunch break? And instead of looking at your phone, like you read a book while you're eating your lunch. That's fine. It's multitasking, but it's a healthy form of it. So yeah, I think a lot of it's just about like, setting in the New Year's, I would say is like a good time to kind of set a goal and a new healthy intention. So if you set a goal of, let's say, reading 15 minutes a day, either maybe just starting on the weekends and then gradually adding weekdays, that would be super helpful. And you'll be surprised by how quickly, you can get through a book if you just chip away at it every day. And I think maybe for some people, having like an accountability partner or joining a book club can also be helpful. So you can decide if that's for you. Personally, I'm more of just kind of a stack of books and, grab the one of the five that I'm working on at any given time and read that. And I don't really want to have to like finish it by Friday to talk about it with somebody. So, figure out what works for you.
I think this is something that I personally have struggled with tremendously, particularly recently. Even right before we got on this call, I was trying to look up some task management software and comparing all the options and watching all the YouTube videos so I can figure out, how I'm going to wrangle all the various projects in my life, because even I find it incredibly difficult. And I know that in the book, you talk about this idea that part of it is training your attention span. It's not just that you'll wake up
Mhm.
one day and magically you'll be able to manage all these things, but actually there's some iterative process by which you have to learn to get better at these things. But maybe there's some balance of nature and nurture. I think you wake up every day without an alarm and you have a regular nap every day at like 1:30 or something like that. I cannot take any naps at all. I hate naps. I don't even like sleeping that much. And I will say there's two reasons. One of this could just be, oh, I'm a workaholic or something like this. But the other reason, I think the deeper reason, and my friends can attest to this if any of them listen, it is very hard to wake me up. I wake up at a divinely appointed time. When I wake up, it's the time I've woken up. Very often this will be early, but I have almost no control of when that happens. If you are outside my door banging and knocking, I might not hear a thing. People have tried waking me up. It's not easy. And so if I take a nap, I think usually, and this is the problem, I might sleep for like 4 hours at a time. So let's say I go to bed and then I wake up and it's been 5 or 6 hours. Okay, fine, that was a sleep. Now I'm awake. It's now the next day. Let's say I slept at 11 p.m. Now it's 5:30 in the morning. I'm ready to go. Let's just do the day. Sometimes I wake up a bit earlier, but the problem is sometimes I try to go back to bed and then I think it's going to be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then it's 4 hours. And then, so I just avoid it. So anyway, all of that rambling to say, how do you think for other people trying to find this balance of, okay, how do I schedule my time? How do I manage my day? How do I manage and build my attention span, not just for reading, but also to be able to attend more meaningfully to other areas of my life?
So really good questions. And I think, one thing we recognize is like everyone's different. And a lot of it does come down to maybe genetics and, habits growing up and things like that. So just like reading a book or listening to someone be like, oh, I like that. Why doesn't that work for me? And being hard on ourselves is probably not going to result in making a positive change, that people want to make. That being said, I mean, I think we can train ourselves to do almost anything, and it just might take months or years. But you have to believe in, why you're doing it, right? So like becoming a napper is not necessarily like a goal in itself. For me, like I realized that over my life, like I always enjoyed kind of coming home and taking a power nap, like more of a kind of 20-minute nap. And then it basically resetting my computer, like shutting it down, powering it back up. And it was like everything works better. That was just like the way I felt about my brain and my productivity after a nap. Like it was just a second day for me. But, the studies have shown like that only for most people, that only really happens if you take that power nap, like the 15 to 20-minute nap. If you get into deep sleep and REM sleep, like you get kind of groggy when you wake up if you don't sleep for the 5 or 6 hours. Like if you sleep for 1 to 2 or 3, like it could have a negative impact. And I've seen it before because I'll just be exhausted and I'll fall asleep on a Saturday. I'll wake up an hour and a half later. I'm like, can I just go to bed? And it's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, and I'm not great at sleeping for 18 hours. We can train ourselves to do almost anything by like starting small, setting the intention, repeating it every day, checking in and reevaluating like what's working, what's not working. And in the book, the 12 Monotasks, I talk about especially how to like do things without your phone. So like what tends to happen is like you'll go down a path, be like, I'm gonna take a nap. Oh, well, I'm just gonna look at my phone for a second. Oh, next thing you know, like, oh, I gotta get back to my desk. Like and the time for napping is over. Same thing. I'm gonna go for a walk, I'm gonna bring my phone and make a call. Then you like don't really notice anything, don't necessarily get good exercise. You don't get the like relaxation of going for a walk out in nature. So I think I talk in the book about like disassociating everything from your phone, whether it's like listening in a conversation or driving somewhere or learning something new. Like put your phone down. I mean, you might be learning on there, but if you can just kind of like untether yourself, put your phone in a drawer in another room, learn how to go for a walk without it and realize that the world doesn't end. And then, do that one activity with your full attention and try to repeat that process every day. And then by doing that, you build up what I call monotasking muscles and that they turn out to be kind of transferable. So the muscles you built by being able to listen in a conversation, but not be distracted by your phone and notifications and texts and all that, like turn out to be helpful when you're reading a book. And the things to like be ability to sit still and pay attention while reading 20 pages in a book turn out to be helpful, when you want to learn how to play a new piece of music or learn a new language. And you can like just realize that there's this part of your brain that you're like reconnecting to be able to focus and pay attention.
Yeah, I think you actually have inspired me to try it. And I know it's the kind of thing that people say a lot, oh, try going without your phone. But I think it's not just the phone,
Mm,
it's the cascade of things that are connected to that. Because, for example, I mentioned I walk a lot, but I walk and let's say I'm listening to a nonfiction book. I'm walking, I have my AirPods, I'm listening to a book while I'm walking, and then I'm holding my phone. Maybe I'm taking notes, maybe I'm, then getting distracted and going on Twitter. And so it's this combination of all these things. And so while I am, paying attention to nature and trying to notice things, and there are times, a decent amount of time where I'm actually not on my phone, but it's just the closeness of it. It almost has an attractor state, which gravitates me to get distracted and to go and do something and to fill
hmm
spaces with attention.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned something like this earlier, just this idea that sometimes, very often, wherever we are, you could be on the train, you could be in the supermarket. The phone is the thing that you use to fill the space that you might otherwise be
hmm
interacting with life. And in fairness, there is a part of this where people have always had this complaint, right? People said this about newspapers. Oh my gosh, why is everyone,
hmm
they've got their head stuck in the newspaper when they could be interacting with people around them and blah, blah, blah. So fine.
Yep.
But I think it's definitely doubly so now because like not only can I not hear you, I can't see you, I am completely in a completely separate world. And that can sometimes be useful. But I'm not fully experiencing leaving my phone at home. I haven't done that. I haven't done that. Or leaving my AirPods at home. I haven't done that. I go out and I have all these things. Even when I think I am paying attention, it always breaks. I walk around for 5 minutes and
mm
then I check my phone and I just see what's going on and I do this little thing here and there. And it's interesting
Yeah.
how just not spending that much time completely alone with my thoughts without any utensils, without any other things that could take my
Yeah.
attention somewhere else. Like you say, it kind of does steal away from your ability to then, whether it's reading books or to pay attention in other areas as well.
I think it can be helpful also to like make a list, like make some notes, like we were talking about before. Not in this case about a book, but like, what is it you're actually worried about if you don't take your phone? Like that you're going to get in an accident, get injured, your kids are going to need to reach you, like, and miss an important business call. Like just name it, write it down on paper. Maybe, assign a probability to it. Like, is that, what are the odds that when I go for this 15-minute walk that happens? And that I can't do anything about it. And, recognize like, again, go back in history, like for thousands of years, millions of years, whatever. Like, I mean, you couldn't respond instantaneously to everything. So just because we can right now and you can find out about something like doesn't mean that it's better or that it's essential. So I think like letting go of those kind of connections to the outside world for a little while and just like going inward and internal, can be really helpful. Obviously, if you're like a doctor on call, you can't do that or can't do it at certain times, but there are certain times you can. And I think it's worth doing that. And it just like you kind of like rebuilds some of your, own just psychological, emotional integrity and physical integrity too, to untether yourself from everything else for a little while.
Yeah. Maybe one of the last questions that I'll ask is do you have, I mean, first of all, we've identified there's this problem, loads of people have this problem. There's kind of two ways you could go about it, addition and also subtraction. Subtraction is do less, leave the
Mm,
phone, remove some of these things. But then addition, which is probably what most people gravitate towards, is what is the new app that I must use or what is the new extra thing that I could have in my life? I'd love to know maybe the simplest recommendation that you have for someone listening to this in both directions, perhaps. Is there anything that you do add in your life or use as a tool to help you be more focused and to do one particular thing at a time? Is there, something you would add? And then is there something subtract? You mentioned the phone. Is there anything else that, or a particular way of thinking of how we can, by removing something, gain better attention and have more focus and be able to attend to tasks in a much better way?
Yeah, I mean, as far as something I add, like it's adding to subtract to a certain extent, but like, email is one of my problems. I mean, I get way too many emails, like a lot of people, and feel like I need to at least look at them. It added a Gmail, whatever they call it, app extension. I think it's called Sane, Sane, and it basically like sorts out, all the spam and like, you can train it. So I try to use that to like cut down on the number of emails that I have to read. And it's worked a fair amount. Some stuff, gets put in spam or whatever that shouldn't, but for the most part, like it increases my efficiency to be able to see things that are important. And as far as taking things away, I basically find the tools that kind of work for me and my business and then stick to those. And I try not to keep adding things. It's interesting, like when you run a business and everybody else is, has different kind of mindsets about this. And they're like, we should use Slack and we should use, this AI tool and this marketing automation, that. And at first you're like, oh, I'm so glad that they're like out there looking at all these things and evaluating them. But like, there's a certain susceptibility to just like, it's the shiny new object and everyone else is doing it. So we should do it. Like a lot of other people, companies, we explored ChatGPT, chatbots and stuff. I just thought the writing was terrible and cheesy, and I could, tell if something was written by AI every time. Maybe it'll get better, but like I didn't find a real business case for like being the kind of company that we are, literary with attention to detail and creativity and all that, like where it made sense. So, we kind of will add something like that and then take it away or find an appropriate use for it. Which I think these days for us, it's like, using the note taker option on our calls so that people who weren't on the call or some people couldn't remember what we decided, like could just go back and look at Otter, AI to read the notes and the summary of the call. So that can be put to appropriate use and not like running your whole life, like can be effective.
Is there anything you can or would like to share about your upcoming book, the one that you're working on now?
Yeah. I mean, it's so like I mentioned, I grew up in New York City. My parents had a famous restaurant called the Quilted Giraffe. My dad was the chef. He was actually a lawyer turned chef. So interesting career change. My mom ran the front of the house, took the reservations and ran the dining room. And they opened it when I was 3 and had it all through. They closed it when I was in college. And basically, if I wanted to see my parents, I had to go to the restaurant and at least like attend staff dinner or go shopping in the walk-in refrigerator or work there. We lived above it for a while, so I could see them then too. But it's a really fascinating story about like New York City in the 1980s when, all good food at that point was considered to be French food, right? You had to go train in a French kitchen. You had to name your restaurant, Chez Panisse or Lutèce, La Côte Basque. Some people were actually French, some people were not. And my parents were kind of like the upstarts that never went to culinary school, never trained in France, and basically decided to kind of pioneer a new form of American cuisine and integrate like influences from Japan and France and, other parts of the world and do things like farm to table before there was ever a name for it, and fusion cuisine before there was a name for it. And for a long time, it was the most expensive restaurant in America. So it was a very like luxurious experience. And, I would be home upstairs and my mom would call up and be like, hey, Mick Jagger's here for dinner. Do you want to come meet him? So I'd just come downstairs and have him like sign in a record album that we had around, which I still have. And, so fascinating experiences growing up. And so I'm going to tell the story essentially both of like my childhood growing up there, as well as like the restaurant's biography and all the like innovations they made in the world of restaurants and food and how that's influenced, the big restaurateurs today in the world we live in, with people celebrating kind of food culture and everything from chef's table to the bear. Like it kind of ties into that, popularity of food and restaurants and as well as like innovation and entrepreneurship. So
Oh, amazing. That sounds, I mean, I did
yeah.
some reading about the restaurant in preparing for our
Mhm.
conversation, but I would love to read that. That sounds so exciting, so interesting.
Cool.
And it was a really interesting story
Awesome.
from,
That gives me
from what
some
I've seen
inspiration
anyway.
to get back to work on it.
Okay, last question. This can either be, you can take this the way you want. Either what is the book that you've gifted the most, or is there any particular book that you would recommend? Maybe 2 books to listeners. I think particularly because you, just as you were talking about, your formative years growing up around the Quilted Giraffe, you've got kids that are around college age now. I'm not sure if you've gifted them books in the past or you've given them any tips on how to cultivate their own libraries. But I'd love to know, from someone that spent so much time around books, helping to put together collections of books for people, assumingly having gifted books to people in the past, are there one or two books that come to mind when you think about, oh, these are books that I would always try and give to someone?
That's a really tough question to ask somebody who like does this for a living and always like personalizes around who the recipient is. But I will say, I think for understanding the world we live in right now, like anything by Kurt Vonnegut, like a Kurt Vonnegut anthology, is really helpful to kind of understand. Like, I mean, great storytelling, great characters, and also just like understanding kind of the corporate, culture and like, what businesses versus individuality and politics and just like understanding where we're at in terms of politics and stuff right now in an entertaining story format. Slaughterhouse-Five is his most famous book. Cat's Cradle is a great book. Breakfast of Champions, another one. So cheating by giving you more than, two books. And then in the food world, I mean, I think I've reread Kitchen Confidential recently. Anthony Bourdain, brilliant writer. And I think just for like somebody who reinvented a genre, like nobody knew that you could make food writing exciting. Some people will argue with me about that, but for him to come along in like the late 90s, early 2000s when he did that, it was just like a revolution in a genre. And I really love writers and thinkers and creatives who just like reinvent something that people didn't know needed to be reinvented, right? I've kind of done that with books. My dad did that with food, and so I really have a lot of respect for somebody like Anthony Bourdain and being able to do that as a writer.
Okay, amazing. Both of those, well, Kitchen Confidential and also Cat's Cradle are books I haven't read, so they're on my list, and I do need to get around to reading them. So
Cool.
thank you so much for making the time. Honestly, it's been a really engaging and exciting conversation for me.
Yeah, thank you, David. This is a real pleasure for me as well. So thank you for all the time and the great conversation.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do stay tuned for more. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps the podcast. And follow me on Twitter. Feel free to shoot me any thoughts. See you next time.